Welcome to a short introduction to data storytelling. Nowadays, data is really all around, and handling this data is a key competence of our times. Google's chief economist, he resolved handling data to be able to understand it, to be able to process it, to extract value from it, to visualize it, to communicate it. And he said that this ability is a hugely important skill in the next decades. And we already see this skill being essential, in the field of business analytics for some time now, for example. But there are more and more professions which require this skill as well, like politics, political consulting, or even journalism. And nowadays, there are quite a few words for this skill. Data storytelling is one of them, data journalism and others. But, in the end, all these modern words, they all describe the same thing. And this is part, at least to a certain part, information visualization. And in fact, this is not new. The foundations of graphical methods to statistics, they go way back to the 18th century. Here, for example, we have a chart from Joseph Priestley, which dates to 1765. It's a chart of biography, where individual lifespans were visualized by these black bars. And the whole can be used to compare the lifespans of multiple persons. And this is really an early and very successful example of visualizing data. When we talk about visualizing data and graphical statistics, we need to talk about William Playfair, because he was really the key person who shaped this new field of graphical statistics. He invented really a huge number of charts, bar charts, line charts. This here is an example of a line chart, line graph he invented. And he motivated our, in his times, new field of research to cope with the increasing complexity of modern commercial life. And this was in the end of the 18th century. So visualizing data, there are two types of visualizing data, and they differ by their aim. The first one is for the first one, the aim is to find something. There are explorative visualizations. So it's very seldom that these explorative visualizations are published or that they are shown to somebody outside the research team. Often these explorative visualizations are to get first impressions of the data. They are to validate your data, something like that. And the second aim of visualizing data is to show something. This is really the huge field of information visualization. And there are three really important elements to information visualization. The first one, what is the substance? So what is the information that you want to visualize? What's the design? How is it possible to represent the substance of your data? And how to realize, what algorithm do you need to visualize your data or visualize your information? And of course, when we talk about data storytelling, it is really, not debatable, it's part of the information visualization. To borrow words from, business people, data storytelling is a structured approach for communicating data insights, which contains, of course, the data, the visuals, and the narrative. And these three things, they interact differently. The narrative may explain your data, the visual elements or the visualization might enlighten your audience to the insights. What does it mean? Imagine your only visual elements are rows and columns of a data table. Then, for example, a lot of interesting patterns, the outliers of the data, they all would remain hidden without any help of data visualizations. And in the end, the narrative should help engage your audience, or even entertain it. Why is the narrative important? Well, because in the context of a story, your results or your research might become more understandable, more relatable. People can understand conclusions that are drawn. People can understand consequences from your story. But of course, telling stories about data, well, it is a dangerous profession, because you need to be careful what stories to tell. Here is an example from William Playfair from 1821, where he combined the weekly wages of a good mechanic and the price of a quarter of wheat over time. And well, you could say this is an information visualization which is really at the border of being propaganda. So when we talk about data storytelling, we absolutely need to talk about storytelling integrity. And what is crucial about telling trustworthy stories? Well, don't try to fit the data to the narrative. This is really very important. Don't try to fit the data to the narrative. Rather, associate your research only ever with a question, but never an objective. And build your narratives only when the results are completed, validated, and when any potential weaknesses are highlighted. This is really your responsibility your responsibility in being the data professional. The above part is a citation from 2018. As you can see, the second part of the slide dates back to, again, the late 18th century, where also William Playfair unveiled that by choosing certain representations of data, certain visualizations of data, there might be deceptions in your visualization of which people are not easily aware of. But, well, moving along to the essential parts of your data story, what is important when you want to talk about your data story? Well, first of all, it's the context. Outline the reasons why your analysis was undertaken and be clear on the question that is trying to be answered with your research. This, of course, also includes outlining prior work or related work. Embed your work into a general context. Of course, record the methodology that you use. If there has been a certain choice, explain it and be transparent about the gaps or the weaknesses and how they might impact your conclusions in the end. And of course, how they might impact the accuracy and reliability of your results, of course. Then, of course, your data story is about your results. This is really the core of every data story, I'd say. But when you talk about your results or when you present your results, make sure that you performed your analysis in a repeatable way that, well, basically anyone can repeat your analysis with your data and come to the same results. Ensure, of course, that appropriate statistical standards are fulfilled, and which is very important, record the instances when your results do and do not meet these standards. Yeah, in your discussion, well, this goes, or this is more the peer review aspect that is mentioned here. This is, well, relates to the scenario where you publish your results. And your findings, your data story, your whole approach might become more trustworthy and more solid when you ensure peer review before publication. In your discussion, of course, also compare your findings with other results from your own work, from other work, and which is very important, be fully transparent about where conclusions, well, for example, cannot be directly drawn from your results. And which is very often a dangerous borderline, clearly highlight where causality cannot be assumed from looking at your data. Yeah, and in the end, your conclusions, only for solid conclusions, think about the most compelling way to communicate these conclusions to whomever is interested. So at the core of data storytelling, it is about substance. It is about visual excellence. This visual excellence is a set of principles which is collected by Edward Tufte, who is a statistician and an artist and a professor emeritus of political science, statistics, and computer science at Yale University. And he wrote several books on data visualizations, some of which are already classics. Like this one here, the display of quantitative the visual display of quantitative information. And well, for reaching visual excellence, the most important principle is show the data. Induce the viewer to think about the substance of the findings, to think about the substance of the data, to think about your core message rather than your methodology or the graphical design or other aspects. And all the other visual or all the other principles related to this visual excellence, well, they you could summarize them by communicating the substance of the data in a very efficient and consistent way. And now to the end of data storytelling. Let's move to some examples again. And these are, first of all, again, historical, classical examples. This, for example, is a map of Jon Snow, which goes back to 1854. There was a huge cholera outbreak in the Broad Street in London, which killed over 600 people. And Jon Snow plotted the numbers of deaths onto a map, which can be seen by these individual black bars here. And from his visualization, he was able to identify an infected water pump. Well, and why is this a classical or a good example of data storytelling? Well, the relation between the water pump and the hotspot of the cholera outbreak becomes quite obvious just from an appropriate visualization, really. and it's an example of a good combination of data and visual elements to reveal a story, to transport a narrative. Another, well, really classical example is the carte figurative, which goes back to 1869, and it was created by Minard. And he created both a map and a time chart, really, of Napoleon's campaign and retreat from Russia. His campaign to Russia and retreat from Russia. At the left side of the graphic, we see the river Niemen. And we can see here that 422,000 men were crossing the Niemen in 1812 on their way to Moscow, which is represented by the light brown bar. And the black bar at the bottom represents the same number of troops on their way back to the river Niemen. And it's an absolute brilliant visualization combining information about time and location. It's really the first flow chart, and it's telling a huge story by very, very simple means. And now, last but not least, let's turn to a more recent web-based interactive example. It's conducted by Al Jazeera in 2019, and it's an interactive visualization of roll call votes from the UN General Assembly. It's been over 6,000 of such votes, and yeah, they span a time interval from roughly 70 years. And it's a very good example, but it's also a very complex one, because you can see that every visitor can find an individual narrative inside this data. What you can see here are at the right the individual countries, and for each country we can see here the number of votes that were yes, no, or that were abstained. And the votes are aggregated towards certain topics here. By hovering over certain charts, we can directly see the raw data that is behind, the raw numbers that is behind these visual elements. That's where this is really interactive. And this interactiveness allows the exploring of the data set under the perspective of a narrative, of an individual narrative. And then in the end, the annotations in the data and informative elements like slideshows and texts transport and underline the narrative really with substance. I would recommend to have a look at this Al Jazeera example, and with that, let me say thank you for your attention.